Okay, here we are. All right. I appear to be live. Let's see. I'm gonna put this cap on, keep the sun out of my eyes a bit. And just going to write a comment on Facebook to let people know I'm here. Okay. Hello, everybody. Let's see. Can you hear me okay? I hope you can hear me okay. So, in about 7 minutes' time, I'm due to start telling you the story of the four dreams of Guðrún. And I've got this stream started now so that people can start logging onto it and watching. But I'm going to need to do something to fill the time up until I'm ready to start the story. So I'm going to read you a poem. Now, this I didn't write this poem. It was written by Philip Larkin, but I don't think he will mind me using his poem, even though it's not mine to use under copyright, because for one thing, these are extraordinary times when we've all got to pull together, and for another thing, he's dead. So I think I'm pretty safe to read Philip Larkin's poem, so that's what I'm going to do. If you have any difficulty hearing me or any other problems with this stream, please let me know in the comments, because this is going to be the time for me to fix any of these problems before we start the story. Anyway, as I said, a poem by Philip Larkin to fill the time before we get the story started. This poem is called The Whitsun Weddings. That Whitsun, I was late getting away. Not till about 1:20 on the sunlit Saturday did my three-quarters empty train pull out. All windows down, all cushions hot, all sense of being in a hurry gone. We ran behind the backs of houses, crossed a street of blinding windscreens, smelt the fish dock. Thence the river's level drifting breadth began, where Skye and Lincolnshire and water meet. All afternoon, through the tall heat that slept for miles inland, a slow and stopping curve southwards we kept. Wide farms went by, short-shadowed cattle and canals with floatings of industrial froth. A hothouse flashed uniquely. Hedges dipped and rose, and now and then a smell of grass displaced the reek of buttoned carriage cloth, until the next town, new and nondescript, approached with acres of dismantled cars. At first I didn't notice what a noise the weddings made, each station that we stopped at. Sun destroys the interest of what's happening in the shade. And down the long, cool platforms, whoops and skirls, I took for porters larking with the males, and went on reading. Once we started, though, we passed them, grinning and pomaded, girls in parodies of fashion, heels and veils, all poised irresolutely, watching us go, as if out on the end of an event, waving goodbye to something that survived it. Struck, I leant more promptly out next time, more curiously, and saw it all again in different terms. The fathers with broad belts under their suits and seamy foreheads, mothers loud and fat, an uncle shouting smut, and then the perms, the nylon gloves and jewelry substitutes, the lemons, mauves, and olive ochres that marked off the girls unreally from the rest. Yes, from cafes and banquet halls up yards and bunting-dressed coach party annexes, the wedding days were coming to an end. All down the line, fresh couples climbed aboard. The rest stood round. The last confetti and advice were thrown, and as we moved, each face seemed to define just what it saw departing. Children frowned at something dull. Fathers had never known success so huge and wholly farcical. The women shared the secret like a happy funeral, while girls, gripping their handbags tighter, stared at a religious wounding. Free at last, and loaded with the sum of all they saw, we hurried towards London, shuffling gouts of steam. Now fields were building plots, and poplars cast long shadows over major roads, and for some 50 minutes, that in time would seem just long enough to settle hats and say, "I nearly died," a dozen marriages got underway. They watched the landscape, sitting side by side. An Odeon went past, a cooling tower, and someone running up to bowl, and none thought of the others they would never meet, or how their lives would all contain this hour. I thought of London spread out in the sun, its postal districts packed like squares of wheat. There we were aimed. And as we raced across bright knots of rail, past standing Pullmans, walls of blackened moss came close, and it was nearly done, this frail travelling coincidence. And what it held stood ready to be loosed with all the power that being changed can give. We slowed again, and as the tightening brakes took hold, there swelled a sense of falling, like an arrow shower, sent out of sight, somewhere becoming rain. All right, well, I'll try not to burst out crying at that, because I do think that is possibly the most beautiful poem ever written. So for those just joining us, this is the live stream on which I'm going to be telling the story of the 4 dreams of Guðrún. Now, this is a story that comes from an Icelandic saga named the Laxdæla saga. It's a very old story, took place in about the 11th century, and it concerns the adventures of a woman named Guðrún Osvífursdóttir. Now, this is not the whole story of the Laxdæla saga. There are many, many other things that happen in that saga. It's an extremely long story. But I'm going to be telling one episode of the story concerning the life of one woman, which is a part that I find especially interesting and have always been very interested in. So this was the story I told the first time I appeared at Maureen's storytelling night at Pub Limerick, and it's a story that I've always been fascinated by. And so what I'm going to do is 4:30 now, so I'm just going to kill a couple more minutes just to give people time to get online, and then I'm going to start telling the story. I'm just going to check a message that I have here. Okay, thanks, Maya. All right. So yes, this is as I say, a story from Iceland, a story called the Laxdæla saga. And I first encountered the Laxdæla saga when I was at university, and this part of it struck me incredibly strongly and always has stayed with me. So yeah, I'm just going to give it another minute or so, and then let's get the story started. Hope you're all having a good day. Hope you're all staying inside as much as you possibly can. And nice to be out here getting a little sunshine on my balcony. Here I've got my my John Deere cap, product placement by John Deere Tractors. Sponsor me, John Deere. I'm an influencer. I'll convince all my millions of followers to buy only John Deere tractors. I guarantee you that thanks to this video, no one watching this video right now is ever going to buy a tractor that's not made by John Deere. I think I can guarantee that. And it's all because of my influencer ways and this product placement that I'm doing here. And I've also got my Maria Bamford t-shirt. Maria Bamford supports me in my journey, my favorite t-shirt. I've just got a comment here. All right, so I reckon it's about time we started the story right about now. So let me tell you something about this story. This happened 1,000 years ago in the Laxadal in Iceland. And as I'm sure you know, when a story is told and retold over hundreds and hundreds of years, it can sometimes grow in the telling. So if there's any part of this story that you find hard to believe, don't blame me, because I'm telling it to you exactly as I heard it. Now, let me begin. There was once a girl named Guðrún, and she was a terribly beautiful girl. And even before she was in her teens, all around her there were many men and boys who stopped and caught their breath and forgot what they were saying when she passed. And Guðrún one summer began to have strange dreams, lots of strange dreams. And there came a day when a kinsman of Guðrún's was passing across the lands of her families, a man named Gest. And the reputation of Gest was that he was very skilled in the interpretation of dreams. So Guðrún, against the advice of her family, decided she was going to go out and ask Gest how he would interpret these strange dreams she had been having. So out she went, she met Gest in his party, and she told him that she had had 4 dreams that were of great interest and asked to describe them to him and for him to interpret them for her. And Gest agreed. So Guðrún described her first dream. And she said, "In this dream, I'm standing beside a river and I'm wearing a very ugly hat. And people keep telling me how beautiful my hat is and how much it suits me, but I don't think so at all. I hate it. I think it's really ugly. And as I'm standing there by the river, the hat slips off my head, falls into the river, and is washed away." And Gest said, "That's an interesting dream." And Gest told Guðrún, what this dream means is that you'll be married young. You'll be married to someone that you don't want to marry, and you won't love him. And at the first opportunity, you will kick him out. You'll divorce him. And Guðrún laughed, because Guðrún didn't believe in the power of dreams to tell the future. It was all a bit of fun to her. But years went by, and though she was still a very young girl, Guðrún's family insisted that she be married to a man named Thorvald. And Thorvald was a very rich man and a very respected man and a very successful man. But Guðrún didn't love him one bit, and their marriage was horrible. And they fought day and night, night and day, and truly hated one another. And one day, when they were visiting the Althing, Guðrún met a man named Thord. And with Thord, she conceived a plan. She would accuse her husband, Thorvald, of wearing women's clothes. Now, in Iceland at that time, this was grounds for divorce. So, when she accused her husband, Thorvald, of being womanly and wearing women's clothes, she was granted a divorce and she was able to leave him. And Thord, who was also in an unhappy marriage, accused his wife of something very similar. He said that she was going around wearing men's breeches, and so he was granted a divorce as well. Consequently, Guðrún and Thord were able to leave their marriages, and they ended up married to one another. And on the day of her wedding to Thord, Guðrún suddenly remembered the day she had described her dreams to Gest, and how he had said that the meaning of her first dream was that she would be married and she would not love her husband and she would divorce him. And on that day, she remembered her second dream, which she had described to Gest thus. She said, "In my second dream, I'm standing by the river again, and on my arm I'm wearing a silver ring. And I like this silver ring very much. But very soon after I put it on, it slips off my wrist and over my hand and falls into the river and is washed away." And Gest said, "That's an interesting dream." Gest said, "What this dream means is that you will be married a second time, and you will love your husband very well, but you will not be married long before death will part you." And Guðrún laughed because, as a young girl, she didn't believe in the power of dreams to tell the future. She all thought it was all a bit of fun. But it came to pass that just 3 months into her marriage to Thord, Thord fell ill and died. And so Guðrún, a second time, was left alone. So, she had been married twice. She had divorced her first husband and been separated by death from her second husband. And at this point, she thought about her third dream, the third dream she had described to Gest. And she had described it thus. "In my third dream, I am standing by the river again, and I look at my wrist and see that I am wearing a ring of gold. And as soon as I see this ring, I become terrified of losing it in the same way that I had lost the previous precious things. And so I decide to get away from the river, and I run up the hill, and I'm running away from the river as fast as I can, but I trip and I fall. And when I fall, the ring strikes a stone and it breaks in half. And only after it's broken in half do I see all the flaws in the metal that made it breakable. And along the cracks where it's broken in half, blood pours out of both halves of the broken ring." And Gest said, "That's an interesting dream. What this dream means is that you will be married a third time. You will be married to a husband whom you love, and he will be killed in violence. And it will be partly your fault. It will come about as a result of actions you have taken, and only after his death will you see the flaws in your marriage." And at that time, Guðrún laughed because she didn't believe in the power of dreams to tell the future. She thought it was just a bit of fun. But it came to pass, many years after her marriage to Thord, that Guðrún found herself once again involved in a love story. After her marriage to Thord, she was independent. She had no need of marriage. And now beginning to be frightened by the interpretations that Gest had given her of her dreams, she paid little attention to the men who from time to time would become interested in her. But there came a time when two best friends named Kjartan and Bolli both became interested in Guðrún. And of the two, Kjartan was the one that Guðrún noticed most. And Kjartan was the one that she fell in love with. But he was summoned to Norway. And he decided that he had to sail away. And Guðrún was furious with him. Guðrún told him that if he sailed away to Norway, then she would never marry him. Everything was over between them. But almost as much as he loved Guðrún, Kjartan loved his sense of duty to his king. So he decided he had to go to Norway. And it's hard to tell which one of them had more regret that day as they parted on the shore. Kjartan, who was sailing away, Guðrún, who was staying behind. And let us remember that Kjartan's best friend, Bolli, was also in love with Guðrún, and he was also sailing away to Norway. But in secret, after they landed in Norway, Bolli sailed back to Iceland. And when he arrived back in Iceland, he went to visit Guðrún, and he told her that Kjartan had fallen in love with a daughter of the King of Norway, and now no longer thought about her. And so Guðrún began to be tempted to accept the proposals of marriage that she was receiving from Bolli, but she still didn't want to do it. But then she remembered the interpretation of her third dream, that her third husband would die, and it would be as a result of actions she had taken, and she couldn't stand the thought of Kjartan, the man she loved, being killed and it being her fault. Now, she didn't like the thought of Bolli being killed either, but she could bear it. She could bear that thought in a way that she couldn't bear the thought of violence being done to Kjartan. And maybe it was that finally persuaded her to accept Bolli's proposals of marriage. Or maybe it was something else. The saga doesn't record it. But what we do know is that Guðrún and Bolli were married. And when Kjartan returned to Iceland, he learned of it and he was furious. And he began a vicious vendetta against Bolli. And he brought his kinsmen with him and he did horrendous things to Bolli. He humiliated Bolli and insulted Bolli. He did horrible things like surrounding a house where Bolli and his kinsmen were so that they couldn't get out to the outhouse and had to piss and shit in the corners of the house. It was so undignified, and people all over Iceland were laughing at Bolli, who was taking all of this disrespect and doing nothing to avenge himself. And finally, it was Guðrún who said to Bolli, "You are going to have to kill him. Your name is becoming mud in this land. You cannot let these insults continue. There is no choice. You must kill him." And Bolli loved Kjartan deeply. And Bolli hated the thought of doing violence to Kjartan, even after all of these horrible humiliations and insults that Kjartan had visited upon him. But finally, he saw the sense of what Guðrún said. And so he took up arms and took some kinsmen with him and sought Kjartan out. And there was a big fight. And Bolli fought with Kjartan, and Bolli's kinsmen fought with Kjartan's kinsmen. And finally that day, Bolli dealt Kjartan his death blow. And when Kjartan was dying on the ground, Bolli wept over the corpse of his beloved friend. But this was 11th century Iceland. This was a Norse society that lived on honor and vengeance and the price of blood. So the story didn't end with the death of Kjartan, no. The kinsmen of Kjartan got together and took up arms, and they sought out Bolli, and they killed Bolli in revenge for what he had done to Kjartan. And so Guðrún found herself a widow again. Just as Gest had told her, her third husband had died in violence, and it had come about as a result of the choices that she had made, though she had tried so hard to prevent that destiny from affecting the ones she loved. And at that time, Guðrún remembered the fourth dream she had described to Gest. And when Guðrún described her fourth dream to Gest, she described it thus. I'm standing looking down into the water. And Gest asked her, is it the same river as before? And she says, no, it's not a river at all. It's a fjord. And I don't know how I can be so certain of this, but in my mind, I know that it's Hammerfjord. And I'm looking down into the water and I'm wearing a big hat on my head. And it's a very beautiful hat, but it's very heavy. It's like I can't hold my head straight because of how heavy this hat is. And so I have to hold my head on one side and try to support it. And I try to keep the hat on my head, but eventually, just like the other hat before, it falls off into the water and sinks straight down under its own weight to the bottom. And I never see it again. And Gest said, that's an interesting dream. Gest said, this dream means that you will be married a fourth time. You'll be married to a man of very high status, higher status than yourself. And he will die before you do. And I would not be surprised if he saw Hammerfjord on the last day of his life. And Guðrún laughed, because Guðrún didn't believe at that time in the power of dreams to tell the future. It was all just a bit of fun to her. But it came to pass many, many years after the whole episode of Kjartan and Bolli. Guðrún had been living alone for a long time. And the fire and anger that had characterized her in her younger years had mostly gone out of her. She lived a tranquil life with her son, Bolli Bollason, who was the son of her marriage with Bolli. And many years had passed by, but then she met a very rich man named Thorkel. And he courted her, and at first she would have none of him, but finally she decided to accept his offers of marriage. And they had a very peaceful and a very happy marriage. And Guðrún did everything she could to make Thorkel happy, and Thorkel did everything he could to make Guðrún happy. And the only rule that Guðrún imposed upon her husband was that he must never go anywhere near the Hammerfjord. Now, for a long time, Thorkel was happy to follow that condition. But I must tell you something about Thorkel. He was a Christian. Christianity had just recently made its way to Iceland, thanks to Olaf Tryggvason. And he was very passionate about doing everything he could for the church. And one day, Thorkel was asked to go and join a band of men who were bringing wood up the Hammerfjord to build a new church. And he told Guðrún he was going to do this. He was going to go down to Hammerfjord and bring the wood up the fjord to build the church. And Guðrún flew into a rage. She told him that of all the things, the only thing that she had ever asked him was never, ever to go down to Hammerfjord. And now he was proposing to go down to Hammerfjord. And he said, why can I not go down to Hammerfjord? Why must I be constrained to stay away from Hammerfjord? And she said, because my dream foretold that you would see Hammerfjord on the last day of your life. And Thorkel said, pagan superstition. And contrary to the teachings of the true church, I will have none of this. I am going down to Hammerfjord to bring up the timber for the new church that we are building by the fjord. And he stormed out of the house and went down to Hammerfjord to bring up the wood. And Guðrún walked to the village church, the one that had already been built, to pray for Thorkel's safety, to pray for Thorkel's soul. And as she was about to enter the church, a ghost appeared to her and said, "Guðrún! Guðrún, I have terrible news for you." And Guðrún, an old woman now, looked up into the face of the ghost and said, "Then keep it to yourself." And she walked on into the church, and she knelt before the altar, and she prayed with all of the fervent hope in her soul for Thorkel and his safe return. But very soon men arrived at the church to tell her that the ship on which Thorkel was sailing had sunk in the Hammerfjord with no survivors. And so, late in her life, Guðrún was once again a widow. Now, just before Guðrún died, she was talking to her son, Bolli Bollason, and he asked her, "Of all those men who loved you, which one did you love the best?" And Guðrún said, "I was worst to the one I love the best." Now, you might wish for a more explicit answer than that. So might Bolli, so might I. But the saga says only that. And as I said before, I'm telling this story to you exactly as I heard it. Now, that's the end of the story of Guðrún and her 4 dreams. But if you want to stick around, I'm going to take a 2-minute break, and then I'm going to tell you one more story, which I'm going to read out of this book here. So don't go away, or do go away if you feel like going away. But there is going to be one more story in just 2 minutes' time. All right, and I'm back again. So, if you're just joining me, we just heard the story of the 4 dreams of Guðrún out of the Laxdæla saga, and that will be on my channel as a video, of course, if you want to check it out from the beginning. And I wanted to tell just one more story. By the way, it's so nice to be able to touch my face again. You're not supposed to touch your face while you're out, but I've been in for the last 5 days, so nothing on my hands that hasn't been washed off by the last 100 or so hand washings here. So back to touching my face again, which I like very much. I never realized what a luxury touching your face is until I wasn't supposed to do it. So I'm going to tell you one more story. It's a story by a writer from Finland, who you may know by the name of Tove Jansson. And the name of the story is The Invisible Child. Now, I, of course, don't have any kind of rights to this story, but as I said before, we are in extraordinary times, and I'm sure that Tove Jansson, if she were alive, wouldn't mind me reading this story to a few people on a Thursday afternoon. So that's what I'm going to do. The name of this story is The Invisible Child, and here you can see a little depiction of that invisible child. So we begin. One dark and rainy evening, the Moomin family sat around the veranda table, picking over the day's mushroom harvest. The big table was covered with newspapers, and in the center of it stood the lighted kerosene lamp. But the corners of the veranda were dark. Little Mai has been picking pepper mushrooms again, Moomin Papa said. Last year she collected flybane. Let's hope she takes to chanterelles next autumn, said Moomin Mama, or at least to something not actually poisonous. Hope for the best and prepare for the worst, Little Mai observed with a chuckle. They continued their work in peaceful silence. Suddenly, there were a few light taps on the glass pane in the door, and without waiting for an answer, Two-Ticky came in and shook the rain off her oilskin jacket. Then she held the door open and called out in the dark, Well, come along. And this is Two-Ticky here in her oilskin jacket. Whom are you bringing? Moomintroll asked. It's Ninny, Two-Ticky said. Yes, her name's Ninny. She still held the door open, waiting. No one came. Oh, well, Two-Ticky said and shrugged her shoulders. If she's too shy, she'd better stay there for a while. She'll be drenched through, said Moomin Mama. Perhaps that won't matter much when one's invisible, Two-Ticky said, and sat down by the table. The family stopped working and waited for an explanation. You all know, don't you, that if people are frightened very often, they sometimes become invisible, Two-Ticky said, and swallowed a small egg mushroom that looked like a little snowball. Well, this Ninny was frightened the wrong way by a lady who had taken care of her without really liking her. I've met this lady, and she was horrid. Not the angry sort, which would have been understandable. No, she was the icily ironical kind. What's ironical? Moomintroll asked. Well, imagine that you slip on a rotten mushroom and sit down on the basket of newly picked ones, Two-Ticky said. The natural thing would be for your mother to be angry. But no, she isn't. Instead, she says, very coldly, I understand that's your idea of a graceful dance, but I'd thank you not to do it in people's food. Something like that. How unpleasant, Moomintroll said. Yes, isn't it? Replied Two-Ticky. This was the way this lady used to talk. She was ironic all day long, every day. And finally, the kid started to turn pale and fade around the edges, and less was seen of her. Last Friday, one couldn't catch sight of her at all. The lady gave her away to me and said she really couldn't take care of relatives she couldn't even see. And what did you do to the lady? Mai asked with bulging eyes. Did you bash her head? That's of no use with the ironic sort, Two-Ticky said. I took Ninny home with me, of course, and now I've brought her here for you to make her visible again. There was a slight pause. Only the rain was heard rustling along over the veranda roof. Everybody stared at Two-Ticky and thought for a while. Does she talk? Moomin Papa asked. No, but the lady has hung a small silver bell around her neck so that one can hear where she is. Two-Ticky arose and opened the door again. Ninny, she called out in the dark. The cool smell of autumn crept in from the garden, and a square of light threw itself on the wet grass. After a while, there was a slight tinkle outside, rather hesitantly. The sound came up the steps and stopped. A bit above the floor, a small silver bell was seen hanging in the air on a black ribbon. Ninny seemed to have a very thin neck. All right, Two-Ticky said. Now here's your new family. They're a bit silly at times, but rather decent, generally speaking. Give the kid a chair, Moomin Papa said. Does she know how to pick mushrooms? I really know nothing at all about Ninny, Tutiki said. I've only brought her here and told you what I know. Now I have a few other things to attend to. Please look in some day, won't you, and let me know how you get along. Cheerio. When Tutiki had gone, the family sat quite silent, looking at the empty chair and the silver bell. After a while, one of the chanterelles slowly rose from the heap on the table. Invisible paws picked it clean from needles and earth. Then it was cut to pieces, and the pieces drifted away and laid themselves in the basin. Another mushroom sailed up from the table. Thrilling, Mai said with awe. Try to give her something to eat. I'd like to know if you can see the food when she swallows it. How on earth does one make her visible again? Moomin Papa said worriedly. Should we take her to a doctor? I don't think so, said Moomin Mama. I believe she wants to be invisible for a while. Tutiki said she's shy. Better leave the kid alone until something turns up. And so it was decided. The eastern attic room happened to be unoccupied, so Moomin Mama made Ninny a bed there. The silver bell tinkled along after her upstairs and reminded Moomin Mama of the cat that had once lived with them. At the bedside, she laid out the apple, the glass of juice, and the 3 striped pieces of candy everybody in the house was given at bedtime. Then she lighted a candle and said, Now have a good sleep, Ninny. Sleep as late as you can. There'll be tea for you in the morning, any time you want. And if you happen to get a funny feeling, or if you want anything, just come downstairs and tinkle. Moomin Mama saw the quilt raise itself to form a very small mound. A dent appeared in the pillow. She went downstairs again to her own room and started looking through her granny's old notes about infallible household remedies. Evil eye, melancholy, colds. No, there didn't seem to be anything suitable. Yes, there was. Towards the end of the notebook, she found a few lines written down at the time when Granny's hand was already rather shaky. If people start getting misty and difficult to see. Good. Moomin Mama read the recipe, which was rather complicated, and started at once to mix the medicine for little Ninny. The bell came tinkling downstairs, one step at a time, with a small pause between each step. Moomin Troll had waited for it all morning, but the silver bell wasn't the exciting thing. That was the paws. Ninny's paws were coming down the steps. They were very small, with anxiously bunched toes. Nothing else of Ninny was visible. It was very odd. Moomin Troll drew back behind the porcelain stove and stared bewitchedly at the paws that passed him on their way to the veranda. Now she served herself some tea. The cup was raised in the air and sank back again. She ate some bread and butter and marmalade. Then the cup and saucer drifted away to the kitchen, were washed up, and put away in the closet. You see, Ninny was a very orderly little child. Moomin Troll rushed out into the garden and shouted, Mama, she's got paws. You can see her paws. I thought as much, Moomin Mama was thinking, where she sat high in the apple tree. Granny knows a thing or two. Now, when the medicine starts to work, we'll be on the right way. Splendid, said Moomin Papa, and better still when she shows her snout one day. It makes me feel sad to talk with people who are invisible and who never answer me. Hush, dear, Moomin Mama said warningly. Ninny's paws were standing in the grass among the fallen apples. Hello, Ninny, shouted Mai. You've slept like a hog. When are you going to show your snout? You must look a fright if you've wanted to be invisible. Shut up, Moomin Troll whispered. She'll be hurt. He went running up to Ninny and said, Never mind, Mai. She's hard-boiled. You're really safe here among us. Don't even think about that horrid lady. She can't come here and take you away. In a moment, Ninny's paws had faded away and become nearly indistinguishable from the grass. Darling, you're an ass, said Moomin Mama. You can't go about reminding the kid about those things. Now pick apples and don't talk rubbish. They all picked apples. After a while, Ninny's paws became clearer again and climbed one of the trees. It was a beautiful autumn morning. The shadows made one's snout a little chilly, but the sunshine felt nearly like summer. Everything was wet from the night's rain, and all colours were strong and clear. When all the apples were picked or shaken down, Moomin Papa carried the biggest apple mincer out in the garden, and they started making apple cheese. Now, if any of you know what apple cheese might be, please mention it in the comments because I have no idea what apple cheese is. It sounds nice though, right? And if you're just joining us, we've finished with the story of the Four Dreams of Guðrún, and we're now onto the story of the Invisible Child by Tove Jansson. And Tutiki has brought the Moomin family an invisible child who's been very poorly treated and has become invisible as a result. And the Moomin family are trying to work out how to make her visible again. So out they are, making whatever apple cheese might be. Moomin Troll turned the handle. Moomin Mama fed the mincer with apples, and Moomin Papa carried the filled jars of apple cheese to the veranda. And Little Mai? Little Mai was sitting in a tree, singing the big apple song. Suddenly, there was a crash. On the garden path appeared a large heap of apple cheese, all prickly with glass splinters. Beside the heap, one could see Ninny's paws rapidly fading away. Oh, said Moomin Mama, that was the jar we used to give to the bumblebees. Now we needn't carry it down to the field. And Granny always said that if you want the earth to grow something for you, then you have to give it a present in the autumn. Ninny's paws appeared back again, and above them, a pair of spindly legs came to view. Above the legs, one could see the faint outline of a brown dress hem. I can see her legs, cried Moomin Troll. Congrats, said Little Mai, looking down out of her tree. Not bad, but the Groke knows why you must wear snuff brown. Moomin Mama nodded to herself and sent a thought to her granny and the medicine. Ninny padded along after them all day. They became used to the tinkle of her little bell and no longer thought Ninny very remarkable at all. By evening, they had nearly forgotten about her, but when everybody was in bed, Moomin Mama took out a rose-pink shawl of hers and made it into a little dress. When it was ready, she carried it upstairs to the eastern attic room and cautiously laid it out on a chair. Then she made a broad hair ribbon out of the material left over. Moomin Mama was enjoying herself tremendously. It was exactly like sewing doll's clothes again. And the funny thing was that one didn't know if this doll had yellow or black hair. The following day, Ninny had her dress on. She was visible up to her neck. And when she came down to morning tea, she bobbed and piped, "Thank you all ever so much." The family felt very embarrassed, and no one found anything to say. Also, it was hard to know where to look when one talked to Ninny. Of course, one tried to look a bit above the bell, where Ninny was supposed to have her eyes, but then very easily one found oneself staring at some of the visible things further down instead, and it gave one an impolite feeling. And here we can see Little Mai looking suspiciously at where Ninny's face is supposed to be. Moomin Papa cleared his throat. "We're happy to see," he started, "that we see more of Ninny today. The more we see, the happier we are." Little Mai gave a laugh and banged the table with her spoon. "Fine that you've started talking," she said. "Hope you have anything to say. Do you know any good games?" "No," Ninny piped, "but I've heard about games." Moomin Troll was delighted. He decided to teach Ninny all the games he knew. After coffee, all three of them went down to the river to play. Only Ninny turned out to be quite impossible. She bobbed and nodded and very seriously replied, "Quite," and "How funny," and "Of course." But it was clear to all that she played only from politeness and not to have fun. "Run, run, can't you?" Mai cried. "Or can't you even jump?" Ninny's thin legs dutifully ran and dutifully jumped, and then she stood still again with arms dangling. The empty dress neck over the bell was looking strangely helpless. "Do you think anybody likes that?" Mai cried. "Haven't you any life in you? Do you want a biff on the nose?" "Rather not," Ninny piped humbly. "She can't play," mumbled Moomintroll. "She can't get angry," little Mai said. "That's what's wrong with her. Listen, you," Mai continued, and went close to Ninny with a menacing look. "You'll never have a face of your own until you've learnt to fight. Believe me." "Yes, of course," Ninny replied, cautiously backing away. There was no further turn for the better. At last they stopped trying to teach Ninny to play. She didn't like funny stories either. She never laughed at the right places. She never laughed at all, in fact. This had a depressing effect on the person who told the story. And so Ninny was left alone to herself. Days went by, and Ninny was still without a face. They became accustomed to seeing her pink dress marching along behind Moomin Mama. As soon as Moomin Mama stopped, the silver bell also stopped. And when she continued her way, the bell began tinkling again. A bit above the dress, a big rose-pink bow was always bobbing in thin air. And here you can see the little Ninny following Moomin Mama up the stairs with her little rose-pink bow floating in the air. Moomin Mama continued to treat Ninny with Granny's medicine, but nothing further happened. So after some time, she stopped the treatment, thinking that many people had managed all right before without a head, and besides, perhaps Ninny really wasn't very good looking. Now everyone could imagine for themselves what she looked like, which can often brighten up a relationship. One day the family went off through the wood down to the beach. They were going to pull the boat up for winter. Ninny came tinkling behind as usual, but when they came in view of the sea, she suddenly stopped. Then she lay down on her stomach in the sand and started to whine. "What's come over Ninny? Is she frightened?" asked Moomin Papa. "Perhaps she hasn't seen the sea before," Moomin Mama said. She stooped and exchanged a few whispering words with Ninny. Then she straightened up again and said, "No, yeah, it's the first time. Ninny thinks the sea's too big." "Of all the silly kids," little Mai started, but Moomin Mama gave her a severe look and said, "Now don't be a silly kid yourself. Let's pull the boat ashore." They went out on the landing stage to the bathing hut where Tutiki lived and knocked at the door. "Hello," Tutiki said. "How's the invisible child?" "There's only her snout left," Moomin Papa replied. "At the moment she's a bit startled, but it'll pass over. Can you lend us a hand with the boat?" "Certainly," Tutiki said. While the boat was pulled ashore and turned keel upwards, Ninny had padded down to the water's edge and was standing immobile on the wet sand. They left her alone. Moomin Mama sat down on the landing stage and looked down into the water. "Dear me, how cold it looks," she said. And then she yawned a bit and added that nothing exciting had happened for weeks. Moomin Papa gave Moomintroll a wink, pulled a horrible face, and started to steal up to Moomin Mama from behind. Of course, he didn't really think of pushing her in the water as he had done many times when she was young. Perhaps he didn't even want to startle her, but just to amuse the kids a little. But before he could reach her, a sharp cry was heard. A pink streak of lightning shot over the landing stage, and Moomin Papa let out a scream and dropped his hat into the water. Ninny had sunk her small invisible teeth into Moomin Papa's tail, and they were sharp. "Oh, good work!" cried Mai. "I couldn't have done it better myself." Ninny was standing on the landing stage. She had a small, snub-nosed, angry face below a red tangle of hair. She was hissing at Moomin Papa like a cat. "Don't you dare push her into the big, horrible sea!" she cried. "I see her!" shouted Moomin Troll. "I see her! She's sweet!" "Sweet, my eye," said Moomin Papa, inspecting his bitten tail. "She's the silliest, nastiest, badly brought upest child I've ever seen, with or without a head." He knelt down on the landing stage and tried to fish for his hat with a stick. And in some mysterious way, he managed to tip himself over and tumbled in on his head. He came up at once, standing safely on the bottom, with his snout above water and his ears filled with mud. "Oh dear!" Ninny was shouting. "Oh, how great! Oh, how funny!" The landing stage shook with her laughter. "I believe she's never laughed before," Two-Ticky said wonderingly. "You seem to have changed her. She's even worse than little Mai now. But the main thing is that one can see her, of course. And here we are at last. We can see her." And Moomin Mama said, "It's all thanks to Granny." And that's the end of the story. Thanks for joining me today. I've enjoyed this, and I hope you have enjoyed it too. Yeah, maybe if I can think of some more stories to tell, I'll do this again sometime. So have an excellent Thursday, and hope to talk to you all again soon. Bye.